I am sitting in a coffee shop in Austin right now, exactly 3 hours away from the city where I grew up, sipping an $8 latte that tastes like absolute freedom. My parents have no idea where I live, and my brother doesn't have my new number. For the first time in a decade, my bank account is actually growing instead of hemorrhaging money into the black hole that is my family's expectations. This isn't a breakdown, it is an audit of my soul, and for once, the balance is in my favor. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It started at the Palo Alto Country Club, a place where the humidity of entitlement is always higher than the actual temperature. I remember the exact sound of my father, Brian, setting down his silver fork against the fine china. It wasn't a clink, it was a gavel. He looked at me across a table spread with medium-rare steaks and vintage wine, all of which I was expected to pay for, as usual, and dropped the demand that would finally crack the foundation of our relationship. "Your brother Ryan lost his job," he said, his voice dripping with that practiced, patriarchal authority that used to make me shrink. "He needs help with the mortgage on the mansion. $1.2 million is a lot of house, and we've all agreed that since you're doing so well as a senior architect, you'll be covering his $8,500 monthly bills for a while." My mother, Laura, nodded in perfect synchronization, her serious conversation cardigan buttoned tight. "Family helps family, Christina," she added, like she was reciting a holy mantra instead of a death sentence for my savings. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why the serial founder of 3 failed startups deserved the expansion fund I'd spent 5 years building for my firm. I just looked at Ryan. He was staring at his plate with a mixture of practiced shame and blatant entitlement, while his wife, Tiffany, scrolled through her phone, probably picking out the aesthetic for their next vacation on my dime. The betrayal was documented in the very air of that dining room. I realized in that moment that I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for a lifestyle they hadn't earned. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdraft for 10 years. Now, I was looking at a contract I never signed, being asked to insure a sinking ship while they stood on the deck and laughed. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. The 72-hour clock started right then. I didn't argue. I didn't explain that my business expansion was my future. I simply said, no. The silence that followed was suffocating, but for me, it was the first breath of clean air I'd had in a decade. I stood up, left the tab on the table for the first time in my life, and walked out. By the time I reached my car, my mind was already a spreadsheet. This wasn't a family dispute anymore, it was an exit strategy. I had 72 hours to liquidate my local assets, secure my files, and vanish before their desperation turned into a legal assault. They weren't shocked by what they'd done, they were only shocked that I had stopped playing along. I sat in my apartment that night, staring not at a photo album, but at a ledger. I didn't need to summon memories, I needed to summon numbers. This wasn't a trip down memory lane, it was a forensic audit of a decade spent as a high-functioning hostage. I realized that my compassion had been a luxury my family had overdrafted for years, and it was time to close the account. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and the return on my investment was a zero-balance soul and a drafty one-bedroom apartment that smelled like burnt toast and broken promises. The audit started 10 years ago. It began with Ryan's student loans, $30,000 that I co-signed when I was barely out of my own degree, working 2 jobs and living on instant noodles. Ryan never made a single payment. I have been paying for his education for a decade, and I will be 40 years old before that debt is finally cleared from my record. Then came the car, $5,000 for a down payment on a luxury SUV he claimed he needed for a new job opportunity that lasted exactly 3 months. I never saw that money again. I call it a loan, he calls it a gift, I call it theft. The numbers only got uglier as Ryan's delusions grew. I counted the $50,000 I poured into his wellness influencer business, a black hole of organic candles, and failed branding for his wife, Tiffany. While they were posting 200 photos of their lavish Tuscan honeymoon, a trip funded entirely by my savings, I was driving a 15-year-old sedan with a passenger door that only opened from the outside. I meal prepped chicken and rice every Sunday because I couldn't afford the steak my father was grilling for Ryan at every family lunch. In total, the last decade has cost me $125,000. $125,000 for the privilege of being ignored until the next bill was due. I kept wondering what I had ever done wrong to deserve this role. I realized I had been living in a prison without bars, the invisible shackles of the survivor. Because I was the one who succeeded, because I was the one with the architect's seal and the senior salary, I felt a crushing weight of guilt. I felt responsible for their failures as if my success was the reason they were sinking. My parents used that guilt as a leash, constantly reminding me that I was doing so well, while Ryan was struggling. They turned my achievements into attacks, and I paid it because I was terrified that if I stopped, I would prove them right, that I was the cold, ungrateful daughter they always whispered about, but the shackles are off now. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet, and I was finally liquidating the anchors that had been dragging me under. I had spent 10 years trying to earn a seat at a table that only wanted my wallet. I looked at the total at the bottom of my spreadsheet, $125,000. That is the price of my freedom. It is a steep cost, but as I sat in the silence of my apartment, I realized it was the best deal I'd ever made. I looked back at the table where the entitlement had reached a fever pitch. Tiffany was actually complaining about the outdated vibe of the kitchen in their $1.2 million mansion, even as my father demanded I cover the $8,500 monthly bill just to keep them from being evicted. It was a masterclass in the trap of cruel normalization. In their minds, the exploitation had become so routine that they no longer saw it as a request for a favor, they saw it as a basic right. My bank account wasn't my own in their eyes, it was a community chest that I was selfishly withholding from them. My father, Brian, leaned forward, his face reddening to the color of the expensive Bordeaux I had just paid for. The country club air felt heavy, smelling of rain and the cloying cedar-scented candles Tiffany always insisted on burning. "You think you're so independent, Christina," he hissed, "but you've forgotten exactly where that architect's stamp of yours came from. We provided the environment that allowed you to succeed. We gave you the upbringing that turned you into a senior architect. Your career, your seal, your success, that is all family equity. You owe this family your professional signature whenever we need it." He wasn't just asking for money anymore, he was threatening my professional identity. He was claiming ownership of my labor, my license, and my very future. My mother, Laura, smoothed her cardigan and added that soft, poison-tipped layer of gaslighting. "Family helps family, Christina. Ryan is a visionary, he just needs a little more runway for his smart home startup. If you let him fall now, his failure is your fault." It was the exact same script they had used for a decade. I realized then that they had spent years renting their social status and their entire identity through my hard work. Without my money to prop them up, their carefully constructed world of country club lunches and Silicon Valley prestige would collapse into nothing. They weren't fighting for Ryan's happiness, they were fighting for the host that kept their parasitic lifestyle alive. I watched them, the way Ryan nodded in entitled agreement, the way Tiffany sighed as if she were the true victim of my greed. I realized that their sense of entitlement had become a psychological injury. To them, my simple no was a betrayal of a fundamental law. They had normalized their cruelty for so long that they actually felt entitled to the fruits of my survival. This wasn't a family dinner, it was a hostile takeover attempt. But as my father continued to lecture me on the meaning of loyalty, I felt a new kind of silence growing inside me. It was the clinical, cold silence of an architect realizing a foundational pillar is beyond repair. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon even a flicker of regret, but there was only the ice-cold clarity of a balance sheet. I wasn't just refusing to pay the bill, I was preparing to demolish the entire site and start again on honest ground. The revolution didn't need a manifesto, it needed a moving truck and a legal surgical strike. I initiated what I called my quiet revolution. Within 72 hours of walking out of that country club, my house was listed, my local bank accounts were consolidated, and my firm's physical assets were being created for transport to Austin. I didn't announce my departure, I deconstructed my presence in Silicon Valley like an architect clearing a site for a new, honest build. I met with a forensic accountant on Monday morning. I needed to find the invisible leaks in my credit that I'd felt for years but couldn't quite name. While she dug through my history, I went through my legal documents with a red pen. I systematically removed my parents and my brother from my emergency contacts, my life insurance beneficiaries, and my medical power of attorney. It was a clinical process. I was essentially erasing the fine print that had allowed them to claim a stake in my life. Every signature I revoked felt like a structural repair on a building that had been leaning for a decade. My phone was a blizzard of toxic communication. I didn't answer a single one of the 47 missed calls from my mother. I didn't open the 23 texts from Ryan that swung wildly between "we're family" and "you're a selfish monster." I treated their messages like spam, noise that was irrelevant to the new blueprint I was drawing. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon even a flicker of guilt, but there was only the ice-cold clarity of a balance sheet. I wasn't having a breakdown, I was having a breakthrough. The liquidation was fast. Because I'd been the one managing their delusions, I knew exactly how to dismantle the support systems I'd built for them. I canceled the recurring transfers for Ryan's car insurance and the private membership fees my father had been charging to my card. I treated my compassion like a financial resource they'd overdraft for far too long. By the time the movers were loading the last box into the truck, my digital footprint in Palo Alto was almost zero. I sat in my empty living room one last time, listening to the silence. It didn't feel lonely, it felt like structural integrity. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the designated safety net for 3 adults who refused to grow up. I was just Christina. I was an architect who had finally realized that you can't build something lasting on shifting soil. As I pulled out of the driveway, heading for Austin, I didn't look back. I was moving toward a life where my worth wasn't measured by my willingness to be exploited. Inside my laptop, a different kind of sunrise was glowing, the kind made of facts, numbers, and a very quiet retribution. The final audit report arrived 3 weeks after I settled into Austin. It took time for the forensic accountant to peel back the layers of Ryan's deceit, but the wait only made the discovery of my forged professional seal more definitive and lethal. They didn't come with an apology or a family-themed card. They came in a digital file that felt as heavy as a lead slab. My forensic auditor didn't use soft words. She used data. She sat across from me in my temporary workspace, her expression as clinical as a surgical report. "Christina," she said, "we found the primary leak. It's not just a missing loan or a forgotten debt. It is a lethal discovery." She pulled up a high-resolution scan of a loan application. I stared at the screen, and for the first time in this entire process, my breath actually hitched. There was an unauthorized business line of credit in my name for $50,000. I recognized the company name, a smart home startup that Ryan had mentioned in passing a year ago as his next big visionary project. I checked the signature at the bottom. It was a near-perfect mimicry of my own hand. But it was the secondary mark that acted as the kill shot. Right next to the forged signature was a digital scan of my professional architect's seal. My stamp. My license. The symbol of every 5 a.m. study session, every grueling board exam, and every ounce of professional integrity I had built from the ground up. Ryan hadn't just mooched off my savings, he had weaponized my career. He had committed a felony to fund his delusions. This was the criminal twist that changed the game entirely. I realized in that moment that any remaining path to redemption for my brother was gone. This wasn't a family disagreement about a mortgage, it was systematic fraud. Numbers don't have emotions, and they certainly don't have excuses. My auditor traced the $50,000. It hadn't gone towards sensors, software, or sustainable building materials. The funds had been funneled directly into offshore gambling sites and high-stakes poker accounts to cover Ryan's mounting debts. I had been the invisible pillar holding up their house for a decade, tethered by the invisible shackles of the survivor. I'd carried the weight of their failures because I believed my success was a family resource. But you don't rebuild a relationship with someone who tries to demolish your foundation while you're still standing inside. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a police report. I didn't call my parents to yell. I didn't text Ryan to ask for an explanation. I didn't need one. Facts are lethal when applied with precision. I simply looked at the mismatched signatures and the unauthorized use of my professional seal. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a foreclosure on their lies. I picked up my phone and made one call to the local precinct. Calm, factual, lethal. The blueprint for their downfall was officially signed, sealed, and delivered. The glass doors of my new Austin office were still being polished when my past walked through them. Laura and Ryan didn't come with flowers or an apology, they came with the same suffocating aura of desperation I had spent 10 years inhaling. They looked diminished. The Silicon Valley prestige had evaporated, leaving behind two people who looked precisely like what they were, bankrupt. That Laura's eyes were bloodshot. Ryan didn't even look at me, he just stared at the minimalist furniture as if he could sell it. They didn't wait for an invitation. They cornered me at my desk, the same one where I was drafting blueprints for an honest future. "Christina, please," my mother began, her voice cracking in that familiar, manipulative way. "The bank is taking the mansion. They started foreclosure yesterday. We have 72 hours to pay $85,000 or Ryan and Tiffany are on the streets." "Family helps family," Ryan muttered, but the words were hollow now. They were a recording being played by a machine that had run out of power. He looked at me with a flicker of that old entitlement, waiting for me to pull my wallet out like I always did. He actually expected me to save the home he bought with money he never had. I didn't yell. I didn't point out the irony of them flying 3 hours to beg the daughter they had called ungrateful. I simply reached into my drawer and pulled out a thick, manila folder. I didn't say a word as I slid it across the mahogany surface. Ryan opened it first. I watched the color drain from his face as he saw the high-resolution scan of my architect's seal and the unauthorized loan application for $50,000. Behind the scan was the police report. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a criminal record in progress. My mother looked at the papers, her hands trembling. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's the truth," I said. "It's the lethal evidence of what happens when you decide to demolish my career to fund your gambling debts. You thought my success was a family resource you could just loot. You were wrong. This was the moment of letting go of bloodline to find myself. For a decade, I had been told that family was an unbreakable bond, a reason to ignore my own survival. But I realized that letting go isn't an act of cruelty, it is an act of justice for the person I actually am. Sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is acknowledge that a foundation is too rotten to save. I was finally prioritizing my well-being over a relationship that was never healthy to begin with. Orion tried to speak, tried to summon one last lie, but the weight of the evidence silenced him. He looked at me and realized the ATM was permanently out of service. "I am not your safety net," I said, my voice as cold and precise as a laser level. "I am not your architect. I already helped you realize that every building constructed on a lie eventually turns to ash." My mother collapsed into the chair, sobbing, but I didn't feel the old tug of guilt. I just felt the structural integrity of my own life. I stood up and held the door open. "I have a meeting at 3 o'clock, I said. "And you have a foreclosure to attend to. Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Ryan." As they walked out, I watched them through the glass, realizing they were finally living their lives without me funding their delusions. I rubbed my eyes one last time, not for tears, but for focus. The site was cleared. The ash was gone. I was finally ready to build on honest ground. I'm sitting back in that Austin coffee shop now, watching the sunset bleed across the skyline. My phone is silent. No missed calls, no toxic pings. A few minutes ago, I performed the final clearing of the site. I opened my old family group chat, looked at the years of one-sided transactions and manipulation, and I hit delete. It was the most satisfying structural removal of my career. My new clinic is growing, built on a foundation of hard work and honest signatures. I've realized that sometimes, the best revenge isn't about hurting people who hurt you, it's about becoming so healthy and so free that their opinion of you no longer has a place to land. This is a letter to those of you who always feel like you're on the edge. To the ones who have been made to feel like a resource instead of a person, I want you to know that your worth isn't a debt you owe to your bloodline. You are allowed to stop being the safety net for people who refuse to learn how to fly. You are allowed to build your own life on your own ground, and you don't need anyone's permission to be happy. If you've ever had to choose between your family's happiness and your own survival, share your story below. You aren't alone. Subscribe for more stories of justice and reclaiming your worth.